Thank you. So my topic today is Wysiwyg. Yeah. It's actually a pretty well-known but fairly outdated computer term that actually describes a very cool metaphysical or spiritual concept. And I'm going to get to it in just a minute. But I first want to say, you hear me talk about this quite often, but I want to say that the introduction of computers and technology into the world made my life much easier. You understand, I've been in ministry 20 years. I'm coming up on my 20-year anniversary in October. And when I first started, not everybody had a personal computer in their homes. Raise your hand now. We're going to do it this way. Raise your hand if you do not have some sort of a technological smartphone, computer, laptop, iPad, anything like that in your home, in your possession. Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't actually know, but yeah, I know. Okay, so other than Larry, you understand what I'm saying. So back in the early days of ministry, when home computers were big and those big monitors and stuff, but I would try to explain this concept about that we're all one, that everyone and everything is connected via the one mind. And I'd get a lot of blank stares. You know, it's people, it's woo-woo. It's kind of out there. I don't get it. But now, if I say to somebody that everyone and everything is connected to the one mind, kind of like the internet, y'all know what I'm talking about, don't you? Absolutely. It has given a tangible and real-life explanation to a fairly intangible concept. And my analogy of Wysiwyg does the same thing. So back in the early days, how many of you know what I'm talking about with Wysiwyg? Oh, not that many. Okay, good. Well, you're about to learn something here. So back in the early days of personal computers, back in the early days of early word processing, what was appearing to you on your little screen that you're typing away and you're making a document or something like that looked completely different, unless you knew the secret, than what was printed out. So it looks all good on the screen, right? But then it would print out it and would have all kinds of weird spaces and all kinds of weird things. Now, there's technical reasons for that we don't need to get into, but for those of us who were not computer nerds, it was very frustrating. But what happened is, as computers evolved, as people got a little bit more tech savvy, someone came up with this method that allowed a printed document to look exactly like what was on the screen. And the name for that feature was Wysiwyg, which stood for what you see is what you get. True story. I don't make stuff up. Now, fortunately for all of us, with the advent of more modern computers, Wysiwyg has now become the industry standard. You couldn't even imagine if we were still working with that. So there's no more guessing games as to what your document is going to look like once it gets printed. Well, maybe for some of you, but for me, mine usually looks like what I have on the screen. Nowadays, thank God, the document and what's on the screen look exactly like what you tell it to look like. Kind of a metaphor. Would you agree? Because, going back to Wysiwyg, if the finished product isn't what we thought it would look like, it is almost always operator error. Oh no. In other words, neither the computer or the printer have conspired to make a mistake, to make you look bad. It is almost always the person who is inputting the information. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is it brings to a more personal definition of Wysiwyg. What you see is what you get. Because in our lives, how we see things determines what we see. I'm going to say that again. How we see things determines what we see. So this is a true story. This little boy comes home. He's about 7 years old. And he comes home from, how old are you? 7 years old, second grade, right? So he comes home from his grade 2 class, and he's looking through a book about Africa. And he looks at it and he goes, Mom, look, it's a frickin' elephant. And his mom says, excuse me? And he says, it's a frickin' elephant. And she says, I do not know where you learned that language. You absolutely did not learn it from us. And his mom, it says it right here. A frickin' elephant. What you see is what you get. One of my all-time favorite Ernest Holmes quotes. What we are looking for, we are looking with and looking at. In other words, how the world looks to us is directly related to how we are looking at the world. Is this making sense to you? Yeah. Now, you know I'm not necessarily talking about what we are looking at the world with our physical eyes, right? But rather how we are looking at the world through the filters of our belief systems and our thoughts and our minds. Those are powerful beliefs, powerful filters, because it's our thoughts and it's our beliefs that are going to color how we look at life and what we see. So I'm going to give you an example here. This was a fun example. Several years ago, let me ask another question. How many of you, raise your hand if you have ever been to the Center for Spiritual Living summer conference at Asilomar in Pacific Grove? So not so many people. Yeah, I really wish we would bring that back. But we went every year for 50 years. So this was at one of our organization's annual conferences at Asilomar in Pacific Grove, right on the ocean. I mean, it was just a fabulous, fabulous location. And I loved going every year because you would hear the top speakers and you would hear the top musicians and so much inspiration and so much information. You would just, speakers in the morning and workshops in the afternoon and speakers at night and meditations and music concerts and, just everything for a week. But the challenge was that after a while, you get so much information, right? You'd have to take a break. I would have to go walk at the beach to just let everything sit in and settle in, right? You know what I'm talking about if you've ever been to a conference. Well, this is actually a picture, not my picture, but this is a picture of the boardwalk right outside the Asilomar grounds. And to get to the beach, you have to go on the boardwalk because they don't want you walking on the sand dunes because they're very precious and they're trying to bring them back. So I'm going to leave that picture up there because it's just so pretty. It makes me nostalgic. So anyway, this particular day I'm walking. It wasn't sunset. It wasn't this time of the day, but I'm walking and I see lined up on the boardwalk, not on the dunes, but lined up on the boardwalk, were like a dozen or so artists, right? And it turns out they were engaging in an art process that's called plein air, which basically means to paint in the open air, plein air. So there was a cluster of about 4 or 5 of these artists, and they were all pointing in the same direction, and they're all looking at basically the same view, the dunes and the wildflowers and the boardwalk and the ocean, okay? And they were all using basically the same tools. They had their easel and they had their canvas, and they had pastel chalk, so it must have been a pastel chalk thing, and they had little rags to smudge the chalk and stuff. And yet this is what was so interesting about this, was that even though they were looking at exactly the same scene, not one of their pictures was the same. Each artist had a different color palette, and they were working, even though they were working in the same media, they were focusing on something different. They were creating a scene that was unique to them. Anybody ever been to a paint night at a bar? Yeah, okay, so you know what I'm talking about, right? Well, this was the first time I'd ever seen this. They're looking at the same thing. And yet the pictures were different. They were unique. They were special. It was such a powerful example of what you see is what you get. Because each one of them was seeing through their own filters from their own perspectives and coming up with an illustration of their perspective. Here's how Ernest Holmes put it. He said, each individual life is a unique expression in the universal wholeness. No two lives can or ought to be alike. The one universal life flows through everything. We give individual expression to it. That, watching those painters, that was this quote in action. You know what I'm talking about here. It was the same scene, everything the same, yet it was total individuality. So it's a fun story. I like telling that story. But I always try to give practical stuff here. You know, I can tell stories. I could tell stories all day long. But I want to give us something to work with. So what does this mean to us in a practical sense? Well, for one thing, it means that we need to be secure in how we view life. We need to be secure in how we view life, because every one of those painters, they weren't worried about what the other person was doing. They were trusting their own creativity. They were trusting the view that they were seeing through their eyes. Well, the same thing is true for us when we are creating what we see. We need to be trusting ourselves and our inner knowing when we go diving into our soul. We need to know that. So let me ask a question. Has anybody here been in a position where someone else has told you you were wrong about something? And yet you knew in your heart of hearts that what you believed was right? It was right for you? Yes? Yeah. Maybe someone, for instance, told you that coming to a center like this was wrong for you, that you were making a mistake. Huge mistake in believing it. Anybody? Yeah, I know. And yet you knew that there was something about this teaching that spoke to you. It was truth for you. Well, here's the beauty of knowing that each one of us seeing our own life and creating our own life through our own unique perspective is that when we do that, it allows us to stay absolutely true to what we know and believe. And this is the cool part that some people don't understand, is that when we know this about ourselves, I am standing in my truth, I am being who I am, I'm believing what I know to be absolutely true in my life. And when I'm walking through life like that, I give other people permission to walk through their lives like that. I allow other people to believe what they believe. And then everybody gets to be right. Yes? Can I get an amen to that? Here's how Ernest Holmes put it. He says, we have the concept of a divine presence which is personal to us. That is the basis of all religions, all life, of everything. And believe it or not, it is the basis of every man's reaction to life. I don't care who he is or where he comes from, what he does or what he believes. Fundamentally, at the root of his concept of life is his sense of relationship to the universe in which he lives. Whew. Get ready, my soul. I'm diving in. I like that song, by the way. Yeah, I like the way you do that song, by the way. So, what you see is what you get. What you believe is what you experience. So that same year at Asilomar, I had another experience that illustrates another aspect of Wysiwyg. What you see is what you get. This was one of the questions in question and answer, by the way. So I'm going to answer that if this is was one of your questions. I don't want to go into a lot of detail because it's kind of a dumb story, especially in retrospect. But for many years, there were two organizations of Centers for Spiritual Living. Back then, we used to be called the Church of Religious Science, way back in the day, right? What happened was these two factions, these two groups got mad at each other, and they both took their football and went home, right? So there are these two organizations. This happened long ago. But the thing was, they went through life all teaching the same thing, but just doing it slightly differently. And then about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, the two organizations decided to merge back into one. Gee, what a novel idea. We teach unity. Maybe we should practice it, hey? But it was interesting because these two organizations had different ways of doing things. They had different cultures, right? And to add to that, both organizations had been holding summer conferences at Asilomar for over 50 years, doing the same thing but doing it slightly differently. So this particular year's Asilomar, I think it was 2012, it was the first time that these two groups had come together to do one common conference. And for some people, getting used to the other group's way of doing things was challenging, as you can imagine. But interestingly, it wasn't challenging for me because I had been involved in the planning of Asilomar for many, many years. So you'd think I'd be pretty set in my ways about what's right and how it should go and know they're wrong. But what was interesting is that didn't happen for me. It didn't happen for me. I intentionally went there with an open mind and an open heart and my eyes open to see something new. And for me, everything was wonderful. I loved it. I came home so renewed and refreshed and recharged. But the reason why I tell you that in a talk on what you see is what you get is that I had several friends who had exactly the opposite experience. For some reason, they were determined to find out what was wrong as opposed to what's right. Anybody ever do that? You know those people? Looking for the differences instead of the similarities, right? So they didn't like the new format, and they didn't like the new speakers, and they didn't like the new way of doing things. In other words, it didn't feel exactly like how that it was supposed to, so they didn't like it, right? As a result, they had a terrible experience. And it's really expensive to go there. So you can imagine spending that kind of money and having a bad experience. They kept talking about what an awful conference it was. And I was like, really? I'm loving it. So again, what you see is what you get. They saw differences. They saw unfamiliarity. They saw change. And so their experience was an unhappy Asilomar. I experienced change, absolutely. There was a lot of newness, things I had not been familiar with. And yet, what I had was a wonderful, fulfilling experience. And I think that's due to what Wally Famous Amos said. Life is just a mirror, and what you see out there, you first see inside of you. Yes? So again, what does this mean to us? How can we take this concept and make it real in our lives? How can we use it to enhance our lives? Well, the first thing you need to do is accept the concept and accept the truth of the statement, what you see is what you get. Yes? Are you with me? I need buy-in here. Yes? Okay. What you see is what you get. Because if you don't believe it and you don't believe that you are cause to your experience, then you're not going to be able to do anything about your experience. If you believe that you are a victim of everything else out there, then it doesn't matter how many motivational posts you have or how often you go on Facebook and look at things, you're not going to get it. You will continue to experience what you are seeing and what you are experiencing because what you see is what you get. So if you think you're a victim, if you feel a victim inside, you're going to remain a victim, and that's all that you're going to see. So the first step is to accept that you are cause to your experience. Say that with me. I am cause to my experience. Let that sink in. I am cause to my experience. We need to understand that we live in an inside-out universe, and nothing will change out here until it changes in here. You know that. And once you've accepted that, then you can look at your experience and you can see what it is you're creating and subsequently what might need to change in your thinking, in your consciousness. I say to my students all the time, if you want to know what you believe, look at your life. Yikes. What you see is what you get. What you believe is what you experience. Now, for some of us, that can really suck. Especially if your life experience right now is not what you would like it to be. It's hard to admit that I am cause to my experience, that my beliefs are bringing about what I want, if we don't understand that I am cause to my experience. So if I change the cause, in other words, I change the belief, I change how I'm showing up, I change how I see things, then my experience is going to change. Anybody ever had that experience in this teaching? That you change your thinking and you change your life? We can change how we see things, how we look at things, and those things change. And sometimes it is simply a matter of changing perspective, changing how we see things. So I thought it would be fun for us to close with a few optical illusions. I know, right? Because in doing this, we're going to be able to see how easy it really is to change how we see the world now that we know that that's what it takes. So you guys ready? Okay, here's the first one. How many of you see the word teach? How many see the word learn? How many see both? You there? You get it? Okay. Maybe it's just somebody telling you, there's two words there. If we're seeing it in a particular way, maybe we don't see it. How about this one? How many see the word optical? How many see the word illusion? How many see both? Now you do. Isn't that interesting? What you see is what you get. Okay, this next one is weird, okay? Just know this one is weird. Okay, somewhere in here is a man's face. I promise. Raise your hand when you see it. All right. I'm going to give you a hint. Amy, can you see it? Okay, can you point to him? Right? You're trying to soften your eyes. So maybe it's one of those where if you no, there's a man's face in Show it again. Is that what you said? Is everybody seen it? Okay. Yeah. Okay, and here's the last one. Anybody not get this one? Everybody got it? What you see is what you get. And that's all I have to say about that. Thanks for coming.